Hey everyone, it's Manero here, and in this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to paint these cherries with watercolors in Procreate. So let's jump right into it. In order to achieve this, we are going to be using the Watercolor Experience brush set for Procreate. You can find it on my Gumroad page, along with a free mini version for you to try out. The link is in the description below. We are going to be using this photo reference by Francesco Cantinelli. I have also left the link to this picture in the description of this video so that you can download it and follow along. This is going to be a detailed tutorial aimed for beginners, where I will go slower than usual and explain every step you need to follow to understand what is the best method I recommend when using my watercolor brushes for Procreate. I want to clarify that this is just my personal process, and it doesn't mean that you can't experiment and develop your own methods when using these brushes, but I hope this video will give you something to start from, especially if you are a beginner. Okay, the first thing we need to do is preparing our canvas. If you want to use the same canvas size as me, this is 8.5 by 11 inches at 300 dpi. Then we are going to import two textures from the ones that are included with this set. Open the paper textures folder and you can import one of these textures by dragging and dropping it directly into Procreate. There is 4 different textures included, feel free to choose any of them. Once it is imported, we need to make it fit the whole canvas. To do that, make sure magnetics is turned on in the snapping options and then tap on Fit to Canvas. We are going to name this layer to stay as organized as we can. And also click on this little N in the layer and set it to multiply mode. Then create a new layer and drag it below the paper layer. Now we are going to import a watercolor sheet texture. My favorite one is called Watercolor Washes 7B Black and White from the more recent update, but feel free to choose any one you like. But make sure to stay within the grayscale ones for this exercise. Then again, we check that magnetics is on in the snapping options and tap on Fit to Canvas. We are going to click on the little N again and set this layer to overlay mode. We'll also name this layer. And to keep things nice and clean, we are going to swipe with one finger to the right on both layers and tap on this group button. We'll name this group Textures. And to make sure that we don't mess up these layers by accident, we can swipe to the left on the group and lock it. We tap on the group to close it, create a new layer, and drag it below the Textures group. We'll name this layer Sketch. Now before we move on, let's talk about brushes for a moment. Just because there is 50 plus brushes included in this set, it doesn't mean that you need to use them all in one painting. Think of this set like having a box full of art supplies in the real world. You probably would choose only the tools that would be right for a specific drawing or painting. For this painting, we are only going to need 6 specific brushes. Robust pencil. This is a good brush to do our initial sketch and final lines for the artwork. Rough eraser. A perfect brush for erasing pencil lines. Bleeding pen. This brush will be very useful for masking different parts of our painting. General wash one. A watercolor brush with soft edges and wet properties, good for laying down colors and blending. Messy edges. A watercolor brush that will allow us to add some hard edges in our painting. And the last one, watercolor splatter number 6, a brush that we'll use for some final touches. As a quick note, there is many different brushes that we could choose from this set to do this painting, and we would get different results depending on the brushes. But for a beginner tutorial, I think it is good for us to stick with a specific limited selection. Feel free to test these 6 brushes on the blank canvas before moving on with the tutorial and really get a nice feel for each of them. Before we continue, remember that you can see what brush I'm currently using at all times by looking at this rectangle right here. Make sure that you are still on the sketch layer and we'll start drawing our sketch using the robust pencil brush. The first thing I do is to block in the general shape of the 3 cherries in conjunction. Once I have defined the general shape, I will break down this main shape with the specific shapes for each cherry. As you can see, I'm not being very careful with my lines. This is just a rough sketch. The most important thing is to position each element in the right place. Notice how for the twigs, I'm marking first where the tip is going to be, and then I connect it with the body of the cherry. Once we have blocked in all the main shapes, we can use the rough eraser brush with the eraser tool and get rid of any unnecessary lines. I'm going to use the robust pencil again to mark where the shadows would be. Now we'll click on the little N in the layer, lower the opacity quite a lot, then create a new layer on top of the sketch layer and we'll name it Final Drawing. Using the robust pencil brush, we are going to define the final drawing using the rough sketch as a guide. I'm taking my time with this, because I like to leave my watercolor paintings with the pencil lines visible as part of the art. I think it adds a lot of personality to watercolor paintings. That's why I want this final drawing to be as clean and accurate as possible. That doesn't mean that it needs to be perfect, but you know what I mean. Notice that I'm not connecting the middle area between the 2 front cherries. That's because I don't want the pencil lines to define all the details in my drawing. I want to leave room for defining shapes and volumes during the watercolor part as well. You can use the same brush with the eraser tool to erase some finer details in your drawing if you need to. Once the final drawing is done, we can hide the rough sketch. Also feel free to use the transform tool to better center the whole drawing in the canvas. The next step is to use the bleeding pen brush to mask the different parts of our painting so that we can paint on each one of them separately. We'll create a new layer below the final drawing, and using any color you want, we'll start contouring the cherry in the back. Notice how I don't care about the parts that are going to be hidden from us by the cherries on front. All we need is to make sure that the shape is closed. Also, this shape doesn't need to be perfect, and I personally don't care if some bits are a little rough or go out of the lines a little bit. That's why I chose this bleeding pen brush in the first place. When mimicking traditional media in digital art, it's a good thing to leave some roughness and imperfections along the way, so that the final piece looks more realistic. To fill up this big chunk of the cherry, we can drag and drop the color right from the corner into the drawing. Make sure to not lift the finger and adjust the threshold by swiping left or right until the color fills the entire shape without leaving any white gaps in the contour. We'll name this layer Cherry Behind, or whatever you want, as long as you know what it is. Then, create a new layer on top, and we'll call it Cherries on Top, and repeat the process, using the bleeding pen brush and a different color so that we can distinguish it from the cherry in the back. We'll mark the contours of the 2 cherries in the front. Again, make sure that there is no gaps in your lines and drag the color from the top right corner to fill in the big shapes. Once we have both main shapes filled in with color, click on each layer, turn on the alpha lock option, and fill both layers with white. Then create a new layer on top of each of the 2 layers, and we'll name these new layers Cherry Masks. Then click on the new layers and turn on Clipping Mask. Now when painting on any of these mask layers, this will allow us to paint inside the different shapes without leaving the area or painting in the other shape. The cool thing about clipping masks is that they are non-destructive, which means that at any point we could move the content around without ever leaving the area. This doesn't mean that we are going to need to do that in this painting, but it's a good thing for you to know that you have the option if you ever need it. Making sure that we are on the clipping mask for the cherry in the back, we are going to use the General Wash 1 brush to start painting. I find that detaching the color wheel to have it always present is very helpful to be able to change the colors quicker. Pick a very light reddish pink color and do a first wash over the general shape. We'll now darken the color towards more red, but very slightly, and add a second wash, but this time we are going to try not to cover the lighter areas as we see them in the reference. Using the same brush, but with the smudge tool, we can blend the edges a little bit, where we feel the transition needs to be softer. Making the color a little bit more saturated and darker, we'll add a third wash, but only in the darker areas of the cherry. Notice how I'm making small and very subtle color changes in the color wheel. I'm looking at the reference and noticing that the darker areas are more red in the right side, while in the left side and the bottom, the color tends towards purple a little bit, and I'm trying to reflect that. I'm also adding a bit more red on the top parts of the cherry, and taking the darker parts further with an even darker magenta with a slight touch of dark purple. Notice how sometimes I'm switching between adding color with the paint tool, or blending the colors with the smudge tool, to soften the edges between the color transitions. Using pure white, we can bring back some of the light spots on the top part of the cherry. Also switching to the smudge tool whenever we need to blend the colors a little. Now we'll repeat the exact same process for the two cherries in the front. First, we lay down a general light pink wash. Then, we darken the red slightly and make it more saturated for a second wash, where we are going to try to leave the highlight areas untouched. If we look at the reference closely, we'll notice that the cherry in the right has some orange tones in the bottom area, so we'll switch the color a little bit to give it that nice color transition. Notice how I'm slowly darkening and making the colors more saturated, while mixing them with the colors from the previous wash, and also being careful to not cover the highlight areas. Now I'm going to do the same with the cherry in the left. Something to have in mind is that this cherry is reflecting the table where the cherries are sitting, so we need to consider that when placing the colors inside this cherry. Notice that there is a strong division of colors on the top middle part, where the color goes from dark to light very abruptly. We'll keep looking at our reference and adding darker spots of colors where they need to be. And at this point we can paint with white to recover again some of those highlight areas we might have lost in the process. We are now going to switch brushes and use the messy edges brush for a while. This brush is going to allow us to slowly build some strokes with harder and darker edges to make our painting look more like a real watercolor. We'll use it specially to add the darker spots in the cherries. Also notice how I'm picking up some colors from the previous wash that are next to my new strokes, and then painting on top of the hard edge strokes to blend the colors so that not all edges are so hard. This will make the blending more rough in these areas, which is great for achieving a realistic watercolor effect. We'll do the same thing for the cherry in the right. Now that we have the bodies of the 3 cherries more or less finished, we can focus on the twigs. It would be easier for us if we separate them from the bodies on their own layers. To do this, we swipe to the left in the layer of each cherry that we filled with white at the beginning and select Duplicate. Then we grab the one on the bottom and we place it on top of the clipping mask. To better differentiate it from the body, we are going to fill this layer with another color. Then using the bleeding pen with the eraser tool, we erase the body area to leave only the twig part of the cherry. And then repeat the same process for the other 2 cherries. Once we have done this, we can fill both layers with white. Click on them to turn off clipping mask. Then create a new layer on top of these 2 layers of the twigs and set them to clipping masks. Make sure to name your layers as you add new ones so that they are easier for you to identify. Now we can go back to the general wash one brush and start painting the twigs. We'll start with the lighter color we can see in the reference, in this case a light yellow. And slowly start darkening the colors towards green, making sure to not cover the lighter parts as we darken the darkest areas. Also notice how the color in the twig changes to brown towards the bottom in the reference, as we want to make sure to reflect that. Feel free to use the same brush to paint the different brown details in the tip and the middle part of the twig. When you finish painting the twig in the back, you can switch to the clipping mask for the twigs in the front and repeat the process to paint these in the same way. Once the cherries are almost finished, we can create a new layer below them to paint the shadow they are projecting on this hypothetical white table. We can use a very desaturated brown, very light at first, and slowly build up the darks as the shadow approaches the bottom part of the cherries. Remember to switch between the paint and the smudge tools whenever you need to soften the transitions between colors. Also notice how I'm making the shadow a little more red and orange right below the cherries, because the color of the cherries is reflecting in the shadow. If you paint outside the desired area, you can always use the rough eraser brush with the eraser tool to fix it. And while we have the rough eraser brush selected, we can go to the final drawing layer and very gently erase some parts of the pencil lines, mainly in the areas that are facing up. This way the parts facing down will have more weight. Here's a nice touch we can give to our painting. Click on the final drawing layer and activate Alpha Lock. Now using the general wash brush, we can colorize the lines in our pencil drawing. Notice that to do this, I'm choosing colors that are similar to the ones in that area of the painting, but slightly darker to make sure that we can still see them. Now let's give our painting the final touches. First we'll select the clipping mask where we painted the two cherries in the front, and using the Watercolor Splatter 6 brush and picking up colors from the painting itself, we'll add these little watercolor drops here and there. Make sure to choose colors that are very similar to those areas where you are painting, but making the colors lighter or darker so that they can be subtle but noticeable. We can do the same for the cherry in the back and for the shadow layer. Just an advice about this, be careful to not overdo it, because it can look bad very quickly if you take it too far. Once we are happy with how the painting looks, we can bring in some of the watercolor stamps that are included with this set. Feel free to experiment and choose any stamps you want. I'm going to add this stamp number 56 from the latest update and put it on top of the two cherries in the front. Then I'll make it into a clipping mask so that the texture stays within the limits of the cherries. Set this layer to multiply mode. And I'm going to bring up the hue, saturation and brightness in the adjustments menu. Now I'm playing with the sliders until I get some nice colors that match my painting. I want the texture to be visible but also very subtle. You can even play with the opacity of this layer to bring it down to your liking. And use the rough eraser brush with the eraser tool to gently erase some parts of this texture, especially in the highlights of the cherry where I think it looked worse. Now it's just a matter of doing the same thing for the cherry in the back and for the shadow part on the table. Remember that you can always alpha lock the layer of these textures and paint on top with a soft brush to change their color as well. Feel free to experiment with this, bring different textures, play with the colors and saturation, and the most important thing, try to have fun. One last touch I like to do at the end is to create a new layer on top of all the other layers, even above the paper texture, and using the bleeding pen brush, add some pure white little touches in the brightest parts of the painting. This will give us a nice effect, similar to painting with a white gel pen on real paper. Once we have done that, we can create a new layer, again below the paper texture layers, and sign our work using the robust pencil brush. I really hope you liked this tutorial, and if you are trying to follow along and have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments of this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more art-related videos, and give me a thumbs up. Also make sure to check out my Gumroad page, where you will find the Watercolor Experience brush set for Procreate, and many other sets that I have available. I'm sure something will suit your artistic needs. All the links are in the description below. Okay, thank you for watching. See you next time.